Welcome to the Challenges and Opportunities for Boys of Color Virtual Community Conversation. I am Elizabeth Trotman, Senior Vice President of Civic Leadership Programs and Initiatives for Foundation for the Carolinas. Today's conversation will kick off a monthly series presented by the Robinson Center for Civic Leadership, the flagship program of Foundation for the Carolinas. The Robinson Center, named for Sally and Russell Robinson, convenes partners and funding to address our region's greatest needs and opportunities. In alignment with this vision, this virtual conversation series focuses on highlighting a variety of important community issues and ways to get involved. Today, we are pleased to have a panel of distinguished national and local leaders who will share their insight and research. At the conclusion of the panel discussion, we will spotlight a local organization that is doing work to improve the lives of boys of color in our community. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, Commissioner Mark Jarrell.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm really thrilled to facilitate today's discussion. I'd like to thank the Foundation for the Carolinas for inviting me to moderate this important conversation. The needs of boys of color is a topic that is so close to my heart. I'm honored to serve as a Mecklenburg County Commissioner representing District 4 with the goal of addressing many of the issues that impact our young men. We have a power-packed panel for this discussion with some amazing and influential leaders. They're going to guide us through the conversation. They are Dr. Frank Barnes. He's the Chief Accountability Officer for Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools. We have Sean Dove, the founder of the Corporation for Black Male Achievement and author of the new book, I Too Am America, on loving and leading Black men and boys. Christopher Timothy Fowler, the President and CEO of Boys to Men Foundation. Righteous Kit, a student at UNC Chapel Hill, Generation Nation board member and co-creator of Apples and Trees, a family podcast. And finally, Dr. James L. Moore III, Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion, Chief Diversity Officer, and Executive Director of the Bell National Resource Center for The Ohio State University. Gentlemen, I want to say welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited about the discussion. I want to get right into it. And we're going to kick it off with the research, because research shows that boys of color experience a variety of unique challenges as a result of pervasive educational, economic, and social inequities. So I'm going to kick off the conversation with you, Dr. Moore. And I want you to share some of the data on issues and outcomes for boys of color.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be in the midst with these esteemed group of individuals. But, you know, when you look at the data, particularly in the educational space, boys of color typically occupy the spaces where there's a doom and gloom, where it's not too favorable. It's clear that many of our males of color are not performing optimally, and it's not because they don't have the capacity and capability. It's because educational systems want students to adapt to them rather than adapting to the young people. And many of the schools across America, when you look at, I don't want the audience to just suggest that it's just low income, working poor, working class folks. I mean, you can look along the continuum, third generation, fourth generation. When you compare males of color to their counterparts, oftentimes there's a widespread gap, unfortunately. Whether their parents went to Ohio State, Yale, or got their degree in the mail, we see gaps. And primarily, I think fundamentally, males of color, in particular Black males, are oftentimes seen as a part of a group rather than an individual. And it's a stigma inferiority that follows them the day they come out of their mother's womb. And that stigma is usually, a stigma is in most cases not positive. And in turn, Black boys have to not only do well in the educational spaces, but they also have to counter some of the perceptions and attitudes that are projected on them on a day-to-day basis. And so in turn, for some, they lean in, some disengage. But let me just tell families who are out there, even if you provide a wonderful educational space and you have financial means, that stigma, it's hard to remove. People see something that is not always positive in the classroom. And I'll close on this, is that I do a lot of research in the gifted and talented space. You can go into affluent spaces. You can go into our urban spaces, rural schools. Black males typically are under identified and placed in gifted and talented programs, even when the school is predominantly Black. So I just want to leave that as something for some people to think about.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Moore. I think that's really important. And Dr. Barnes, I want to follow up with you because Dr. Moore raised some great points, particularly with respect to understanding that socioeconomic status does not appear to be a main predictor. And I'm curious to know what you see in serving in a large urban school district like Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools. Does that hold true? And what do you see relative to the data? And how does it relate to our brown boys as well?
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner Durrell. And thank you again for having us to talk about this important topic. What we see in our data in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, the 17th largest school district in the country, reflects some comparable statistics to what Dr. Moore alluded to, that what we see is a disproportionality in performance between our Black and brown boys, our Black and brown students generally, that includes girls, when compared to their white peers. But what we do see is that in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools specifically, is that as poverty is concentrated, resources tend to be harder to come by, and performance appears to be lower. So although African-American boys, Black boys, brown boys in schools where there is less poverty outperform their Black and brown peers in schools where poverty is more concentrated, even when there's less poverty, there's disparities in achievement. I always in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools want to inform, and I want to say this for our audience, is we want to focus on the average student's performance and the average student's experience. And the reason why I want to talk about average, we want to talk about how our system habitually operates. And for this conversation, I think we need to acknowledge there are anomalies and there are success stories. I think there's always a challenge that as we talk about the experience of Black and brown boys in public education and in other sectors, we tend to even sometimes put forth the image that none of us are successful, that none of our students are successful, that none of our teachers and administrators work on behalf of Black and brown boys with some levels of success. So as we're having this conversation about our local experience and national perspective, we want to think about the average, but recognize there are many who succeed, and there are hundreds of educators who care deeply and believe deeply in the success and potential in Black and brown boys.
So thank you for that, because I think it's really important for that foundation that you just laid really will help lay the groundwork for the rest of the conversation. I really want to turn to now, as we look at the systemic nature of what we're dealing with, whether we're talking about systems and institutions, I'm curious to get your take, and I'm going to go to Sean Dove and then to Righteous in just a second, but I'm curious to get your take, Sean, on how do structures and systems positively or negatively impact boys of color?
Great, happy to be here, and I just want to first shout out Elizabeth Trotman and the Foundation for the Carolinas for having this initial conversation. I want to emphasize initial conversation, that this is not just a one-time event, it's an ongoing strategy. And I think Commissioner Durrell, to answer your question, I want to dovetail on just what Dr. Frank Barnes highlighted around, because I often talk about the paradox of promise and peril when looking at Black men and boys in America, and that, yes, there is daunting data, there is statistics that show that we are in dire scenarios in parts of the country. But on the flip side, there are also promising stories, promising outcomes, and the ability to point to those and look at the assets of Black men and boys and lead with that. And as we'll hear from Righteous, tell our stories. And the thing about systems and structures, we have to look at from whence they were designed. And the answer to the question is that systems and structures have both a positive and negative impact on the life outcomes of Black men and boys. And I often want to start with the intent. The folks that are designing and implementing and overseeing the systems and structures, do they believe in Black men and boys? Do they love Black boys? Are the systems and structures designed for the flourishing of Black boys? And if that is the case, we do see positive outcomes. I'll point to Chris Chapman out in Oakland, who led a district-wide Office of African-American Male Achievement. That was a declaration a decade or so ago within a school district to create a district-wide system and structure that looked at the positive outcomes. And, you know, I think that courage has a important part when we're looking at systemic racism and structures, right? The ability, you know, we often as leaders, you know, we spend a lot of time looking out the window and casting vision and not enough time looking in the mirror, right? And so if we that are cross-sector leaders begin to look in the mirror and see where and how we are complicit with the systems and the structures, and then have the courage to step out and engage in a systemic reform. And just two other things, because I definitely want to hear from Righteous next. When we're looking at systems and structures, Commissioner, I think it's really important that we adopt a long-term view. You know, we have heard the saying that, you know, we overestimate what we can do in a year and underestimate what we can do in a decade. The systems and structures that we are seeking to change and reform have been here for decades, for centuries, and that it is not going to change in a grant-making cycle or a civic leadership mayoral cycle. We have to have the a long view. And lastly, we have to have a systemic approach. We cannot look at systems and structures in a in a vacuum. So we can't look at education and structures and both the challenges and opportunities without looking at health policy, without looking at housing, without looking at the criminal justice system and the economic implications. And how do we look at that as a system and combat systemic and structural racism with a systemic and structural approach?
So I want to turn to Righteous, and Sean, I appreciate that. That is, you're spot on with that. And I want to turn to Righteous because being a college student, Righteous, I'm curious to learn from you when you think about the system and all of the elements that were in place that have led you to where you are today as a college student, and you've been productive in our community. I'm curious, do you think that the system is designed to produce the outcome that you've achieved, or are you an anomaly? I mean, as you walk around your campus, do you see a lot of other people that look like you that have gone through this system?
Absolutely. I think that there is a perception that young Black men and women aren't as successful as they really truly are. But from the way I've seen it, they may not all be going to UNC, but they don't need to, because there are plenty of universities, there are plenty of people who are actively trying to succeed in whatever their goals and visions are, that are attending these amazing schools that are doing these great things. And I think that our perception of what it is to be a successful Black teen or needs to change. Not everybody else is going to have the same opportunities, the same things that are going to happen to me that are going to happen to them. But I think that we should focus on the fact that there are a lot of ways that we can positively impact those who are in high school, who are in middle school, and help them and let them achieve what they're trying to achieve. I think Mr. Dove brought in a great point in which he talked about how we expect change to happen very quickly. And that's the thing that people in my generation do and have kind of brought into the forefront of, we want change now, we want change to be expedient, we want it today, we want it tomorrow. What we have to realize is that it's going to take time, and not only is it going to take time, it's going to take money. And if we want to actually make a change in whatever we're looking for, if you're looking for making a change so that Black students feel more comfortable at the universities that they're going to, or you want people like the Board of Trustees at UNC to be a more representative group than what they are, which is currently 70% white. If you want things like that, you have to actually put in the funds that go into it, understand the systems behind it, and understanding that when you're putting money into the things that you believe in, you're putting money into the things that, investing back in your community, you'll actually solve the problem that you're trying to do. Otherwise, you won't accomplish anything. So yes, it'll take time, and it'll definitely take your resources, and being able to differentiate that and understand that this is what it's going to take to solve the problem, rather than waiting or hoping that someone else would do, is probably going to be the next step.
I appreciate you bringing up the aspect of investment, Righteous. I think that's a great point. And I want to turn to Christopher Timothy Fowler for a second, because when you talk about investment, what you've done through your organization and what you're doing, I think it's just fantastic in the community. I saw on social media where you ran into one of your mentees at, I guess you were at the car dealership. And one of the things that what struck me about that was that we do have young people in the community that are doing it right. They're not statistics, and it is due to investment and time and energy by people like everyone on this panel. One of the things that I'm curious, how do you feel that, like with COVID-19 and the traumatic events that have affected boys of color, how are we impacted, and are we impacted differently than you see in other communities?
Well, I'll talk about the young man first. He's been in the program for 8 years, seven years. So he had an IEP, and he had an IEP from elementary all the way to high school. So he was considered a statistic because he's developmental delayed, ADHD, and so forth. So if you look at his picture, he actually is 21. So through our apprenticeship program with Hendrix, it gave him a lot of confidence and workforce development skills. So we actually had our boys in the program of Mercedes-Benz on Independence, Hendrix, and bumped into him. He said, "Mr. Fowler, I just got hired and I'm working in the Metro Tech department." I was like, he said, "I apologize. I supposed to have called you." But when he goes home, that's when that delay kicks in and things like that. What I was so proud of, that he had the confidence to go through the interview and have his resume and receive that job. So yes, he is a CMS student, and I'm a teacher in CMS for 30 years. I'm not 30 years, I've been teaching in CMS for 17. In my school, I'm the only Black male teacher. So I stay at elementary because of that case. More so, men go to high school and middle school and things like that. So I choose to stay in that level. And what Mr. Righteous was talking about is that funding that's needed, because we do have mentors. There's probably men that's looking to say, "Hey, I want to sew into a program like yours. How do I do it?" So we have to get into those Title I schools, those schools like the Garringers and Martin Luther Kings and things like that, and put those programs. So just like Righteous said, you got to invest in your community, in that school, so that it can bring men in and we can pour this knowledge that we have to those young men in that school. So it will take that funding to invest in a program like a Boys to Men Foundation, our agricultural foundation program, so that we can be in those schools on a daily, weekly basis. Because like I said, it's going to take some time. So when COVID hit and we going virtual, Siemens did a good job, but a lot of parents did not have Wi-Fi. They did not have laptops. They did not have computers. So they lost that connection. And most Black boys are hands-on individuals, myself included. So when you wake up in the morning and have to get up, and my mother had to leave out at 5, 6 in the morning, it is that boy have to entrust the rest of the household to turn on those laptops, be ready for your class. And most of these boys are not in single, they're not only children. So they have other siblings that they had to log on. So now they behind the 8 ball. So now they the parent, the teacher, and the cafeteria worker. So yeah, they did not have that, hey, the husband's going out to work and the mother's home and they can homeschool those kids at home. No, it wasn't the case. It was those boys in the household logging in on Canvas, logging in on Zoom, going over to work. And that's what we don't want again, because if we do that again, what can we establish? So just in case a pandemic is high, we have to shut down and go Zoom again. How can we put men in place or other organizations instead of you might have a computer class, music or whatever. Let's do a cultural class with these boys just in case this happens again, because we missed out on a lot. And those young men had to be teachers, had to be cafeteria staff because their parents wasn't in the house. So that was a major problem also. So even my son, he's a hands-on young man. He's 12, he goes to Piedmont Middle. So we have to make sure that we put these things in place for virtual teaching, virtual learning, and just making sure these young men and these families have the support and assistance that they need just in case we go virtual.
And I think that's an important point that you just brought up. And one of the things that I'd be curious, Dr. Barnes, I want to come to you real quick. What is Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools doing to reveal the early digital literacy skills of boys?
I think part of what we're working to do is actually to build digital literacy. And I really like to think of a term that really I wasn't exposed to much pre-pandemic, but in the pandemic got exposed to, which is the ideal of digital inclusion. And this idea of digital inclusion encompasses the divide. And one part talks about the device. So making sure that we can move to a one-to-one environment where students have the tools that they need. As we went into the pandemic, we were one-to-one in grades 3 through 12. Now, after coming out of the pandemic, we're one-to-one K through 12. The second leg of, say, a three-legged stool of digital inclusion is connectivity. I think this is where we're really grappling, where even as we were distributing, because of the philanthropic giving of our community hotspots, even those hotspots don't necessarily have the connectivity to allow students to stream actively, to have two-way dynamic communication. But even particularly in particular neighborhoods where there might not be as good connectivity, just even in your own house. And I know some of us in the pandemic have experienced those dead spots in neighborhoods and houses with our internet. But the third is what you're picking on, is which is idea of digital skills and being able to bring technology into the classroom to be used, not as the primary teacher, but to be used alongside the teacher. We don't have necessarily a set of competencies. We say these are digital competencies, but including technology in teaching of reading, writing, thinking, and expressing one's thought. Part of what that has been is through what we've called personalized learning, to be able to use technology in learning and spaces. And that's something we're trying to bring to all of our students. And certainly the pandemic has highlighted even more why this digital inclusion is so necessary.
you brought up a point when you talked about being lost in the system. And one of the things I want to tie this to, Dr. Moore, and I'm going to come to you, because when we talk about these young men who were supposed to log on, but did not necessarily have the tools to be able to log on, and the barriers that the families experience, one of the things that I'm always really, that stays on the forefront of my mind, that one way or another, they're going to be picked up in the system. And a lot of times we've heard this term, the school to prison pipeline. And I really am curious, Dr. Moore, if you believe that's something that exists, and if it does exist, to what extent, and what should we be doing what are the tools that people need to be able to really make sure that they avoid that, and what should we be doing as a society?
Well, thank you for that question. And it's a question that it does exist. It's well documented, well chronicled in the popular and scientific literature. You know, my colleagues at places like at Ohio State and other places around the country, we literally can predict whether or not a kid is going to finish high school as early as third grade with 90% accuracy. And I see some of our colleagues are talking about the third grade syndrome. We can predict without even going into school, just having a data table and using some predictive models without me even going with four variables. One, if a kid is reading at least one grade below a grade level, almost 87% or higher of the people who are incarcerated has at least one grade level, reading below at least one grade level. And so reading literacy, there's a correlation with literacy and graduation rates. The second one is you attend a school that is high minority. I don't want people to think that you can't thrive because you went to a high minority. But unfortunately, when we use proxy variables, when you say high minority, it's typically mean under-resourced, because there's a correlation between your school and the property value in places like Charlotte, right? The second thing is whether or not the school is a high, free, and reduced lunch. And then the fourth variable, free lunch, minority. I'm sorry, it was three variables: high minority, free lunch, and reading at least one grade below a grade level. You can predict with almost 90% accuracy that those kids won't graduate from high school. I don't want to suggest that people ain't resilient. All of us have overcome, but I'm just saying, people use that kind of data. There are about 6 states out there that use that data as early as third grade to determine how many prisons they're going to build. And where do we build prisons? If you live in Virginia, it's going to be in Southwest Virginia. It's going to be in those under-resourced, economically deprived areas where there's a void of diversity in those areas. And it becomes an economic engine because, if you have relatives in those places, they're far from the communities where they came from. This is our public policy across America. Some may not necessarily use it to determine how many prisons, but it's certainly an economic engine. Let's talk about education. Some might say, I'm not that I'm trying to perpetuate conspiracies, but who benefits from low performing schools? We always talk about the nation benefits when we got high quality. Who benefits? They're still contracting. There's a whole enterprise around tutoring and mentoring programs. Everybody mentoring program is going to be transformative. And the kid, I've had someone come to me and say their work reduces achievement gap. And I had to tell the guy, if you come up with that, you'll be a billionaire overnight, right? People are selling the snake in the oil snake that we used to, and off the misery of poor, vulnerable people. When we think of the busing system, we think about, if I looked and say, if you really want to look behind the curtain, let's see who getting the contracts in Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, or Columbus City Schools, or Cleveland Public Schools. It's probably not a lot of minority vendors benefiting from those contracts.
Well, I think we probably have a lot of people listening to the call that certainly have been advocating to make sure that people of color are really participating as it relates to what you just said, Dr. Moore. And when we talk about advocacy, one of the things as time is winding down, I want to go to Sean Dove, because I really want to understand, where do you see opportunities and where have we been successful? And what are some examples of successful approaches from your perspective?
Sure, and I think that's a real important question, Commissioner Durrell, because there are pockets and examples of success all around us, right, in the nation, right? I look at the work that David Banks is doing in New York City with Eagle Academy Foundation, which is a network of 7 single-gender schools in New York City and in Newark, New Jersey, over the last 10 years, and creating a pipeline to college, right? I mentioned the work earlier that Chris Chapman is doing in Oakland with Kingmakers of Oakland. One of the things I want to just highlight and lift up, particularly when we look at the backdrop of a global pandemic, of acting with a sense of urgency around the mental health and social emotional well-being of our young men, that even before the pandemic, there were challenges. And I think an upside of the pandemic, and when we look at health policy and look at access, that we see more young men and adults getting vulnerable and asking for help. And when you look at advocacy and we look at what can public officials do, one is acting with a sense of urgency, right? Do we value the lives and the outcomes of Black men and boys? And if the answer to that question is yes, and you believe that, my follow-up question is, and would be, does your belief in Black men and boys and young men of color, does your budget parallel that belief? Because we can make all the declarations that we want, but social change and social impact requires significant resources, right? And so what are the policy and budget and reallocation dollars that we can do? I think at the heart of this work is going to require cross-sector leadership, some of which we have on this screen. And I am hoping out of the 100+ people in the audience that there are representatives and folks with a sense of urgency from the private sector, right? From the education sector, folks from the block and the boardroom, right? It's important that we have youth voice like Righteous at the table, and that every city, if you're really serious about this work, is there a commitment from the mayor? And if there is a commitment from the mayor, what does that budget look like? And I know that there is a golden opportunity in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, right? When you look at what are some of the examples, I would point to the work that's happening right in your city, the work that Don Thomas is leading with MBK Charlotte-Mecklenburg. I know that brother Michael Duvall is organizing YMCAs. And so, yes, it's nice to look outside and see what's working, but it's really even more important to look around you and say, what's working here? Where are we winning? And how do we have both a public policy agenda, but also a community organizing agenda, an inside game, outside game, and knowing that, without any friction, right? And us coming out of our comfort zones around this issue, because when we start, having a racial equity lens, it begins to pull folks out of their comfort zone, and we're not going to change unless we get out of that comfort zone.
That's a great point. I want to read a couple comments in the chat. A couple comments that have been going on since we've had the discussion. One person says CMS should partner with local nonprofits who specialize in closing the digital divide, which I think is spot on. www.powerup-USA. Also, We have somebody who says, great information. It's imperative that we as the community collaborate together to provide opportunities for our Black males before grade 3. And then we have a question that says, what can Black men in these communities do to change the narrative? And so we only have a few minutes left, but Righteous, give us one or two things from your perspective, and then we're going to go around and let everyone wrap up in the next couple minutes. But Righteous, what are two things that you think that we can do in our communities to change the narrative?
Absolutely. I think that first, and I was reading the question, I think that first and foremost, you have to be present. And I think I talk about it all the time, but I grew up with the ideology because I grew up in Rock Hill, South Carolina, which is football city, USA. And all of my family were athletes. So I understood that from a perspective, never mind the fact that I grew to be 6'4", being a tall Black man, that there were perceptions of me and what I could be and what I should be that were not what I thought was going to be for me, were not correct for me. And I think it's imperative that you show young Black boys and young Black girls that, hey, there are so many opportunities out there for you and that you can actually live a dream, live a life that is your dream. And that is something that you want to do. And I think that if we instill that into children at a very young age, that, hey, you can be a commissioner, you can be a doctor, you can be an engineer, you can do whatever you want. Or you can be Black, you can play basketball, you can play football, you can be an entertainer, you can rap, if that is what you want to do. But first and foremost, you're going to live your passion. And that is what I hope families instill in their children. That is what I hope teachers are instilling in their children. And I think that of anything, if you want to change the narrative, you have to change it from the people who are experiencing it. You have to change it from children. You have to make sure that they themselves are not internalizing a narrative that has been brought upon them from decades and decades and decades before. And once you start there, then you'll be able to accomplish whatever narrative change you want to do. But that's where it starts. It starts with the kids that you want. You want them to be able to live their passion. So
well said, Brother Righteous. We got 60 seconds left. I want to go to each of the panelists. Christopher, Timothy Fowler, your boots on the ground. Give us a call to action before we leave, and we'll make it quick with everybody.
CMS just continue to do what you're doing, hire more male teachers in the elementary school sector. I know that's easier said than done. I know Dr. Barnes is trying to do that, but we want to try to put more males in and I didn't say what grade I taught either. It's pre-K. I teach pre-K. Wow. So yes, I know I'm probably one of the few Black male teachers that teach pre-K in CMS. So that's why I stay, because we can get to that early status of raising our kids from good to great. So that's why I stay in that sector. So I challenge them. I don't know if it's got to give males high incentives. Somebody like Righteous, go to his school, try to solicit more teachers, but more bonuses, something that you can reach outside our sector and say, hey, this is what we need for our elementary school enrollment for male teachers. That's it.
Thank you for that. That's a great way to lead into Dr. Barnes. Real quick, got one thing for us, that call to action.
I want to pull out a quote that Brother Sean said. He said, we overestimate what we can do in a year, but underestimate what we can do in a decade. We need to think macro and micro. We need to engage and be present in the lives of our young Black and brown boys, as Righteous articulated. But we also must talk about how do we reconstruct systems that weren't necessarily constructed to give us the success we want. And we need to get away potentially from trying to say, let's fix something in 1 to 2 years that took decades to develop, but underinvest and undersupport the leadership in positions to try to recreate organizations. We can't have it both ways. Change right away, but then we'll eschew the long game. We need to think macro and micro, short and long game, and work together across sectors.
Sean Duff.
Well, the first thing I want to say is to the city of Charlotte, there's no cavalry coming to save the day in your city. You all are the iconic leaders that you've been waiting for, the curators of the change that you are seeking to see. And I would act with risk, urgency, and momentum. And the one recommendation that I would do is in partnership with the Foundation for the Carolinas. If we can get 50 people that are on this call today to launch a donor advised fund at the foundation that is specifically geared to investing in the positive outcomes of Black boys and young men of color in your city. That's a tangible start with a 10-year commitment and growing that fund each year.
And to wrap us up, Dr. Moore, 10 seconds.
Well, I would say 5 variables that I want people to think about in the school: interest, preparation, connections, experiences, and opportunities. It's hard to be interested in something if you've never been exposed to it. Our young men need to be constantly exposed. They foreclose on things because they've never been exposed to it. Preparation is to totality. It's not just K to 12, it's what I call K to grade, because we're losing brothers at every juncture of the pipeline, even at higher education. The next one is experiences that are indicative of the kind of experiences that we want them to have. In connections, academic achievement is highly correlated with the relationship that the student has with his or her teacher. It's also highly correlated with the number of contact hours. If you don't have a relationship, you're not going to have a contact hours. And the last is opportunities. Some of our young brothers, they can't access the opportunities because they haven't had the experiences. They hadn't had necessarily the preparation. So it's important for us to think about a framework that connects to that. And that's much of what my work focuses on.
Wow, thank you. And what a great discussion. Obviously, we could go on all day, but unfortunately we can't. But this is a start, and certainly we'll continue this conversation in the future. I just want to thank all of our distinguished panelists and guests for such an amazing discussion today. Thank you for your work. Right now, I'm going to turn it back over to Elizabeth Trotman, who will facilitate our organization spotlight featuring my brother's keeper, Charlotte Mecklenburg.
Thank you, Commissioner Jarrell. Thank you, all of our distinguished panelists. That was an amazing and powerful discussion. I so appreciate your thoughtful contribution to this conversation. I thank you for even the remarks that said that this is just the beginning. Now, I am pleased to welcome someone that is really focused on doing the work locally, and that is Don Thomas, the Executive Director of My Brother's Keeper, Charlotte Mecklenburg. And Don will tell us a little bit about his organization. So Don, what is My Brother's Keeper, Charlotte Mecklenburg?
First, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for having me. This is, I am inspired and enthused at this kind of multi-sector and multi-generational conversation that you kind of spearheaded here. This is great leadership. So My Brother's Keeper, Charlotte Mecklenburg is one of a few things. One, we are the official My Brother's Keepers network nationally under the Obama Foundation. We are also a kind of systems approach to supporting Black and brown boys. And so our mission is to ensure that every Black and brown boy in Charlotte Mecklenburg has every opportunity to achieve. And we're doing that by situating ourselves as a backbone organization of a collective impact effort. And so we are looking to bring the ecosystem together to support our boys.
And I know that there are larger efforts, as you mentioned. What makes the Charlotte effort unique?
Great question. I think what makes us unique is that we are the official chapter here, where we have become the first in the 191 cities to become our own 501c3. So we are a standalone organization in that regard, understanding the importance of autonomy when you're thinking about creating the necessary strategies to move this work forward. And I think another thing that's kind of sets us apart, makes us unique, is that we are not a program. So we are a collective impact effort, meaning we are not designed to compete with some of the transformative programmatic strategies that have been put forth in community, but we are designed to resource and support and lift up those best practices of organizations that have proven impact over time.
So you're convening and bringing the work of other organizations to the spotlight, and I assume helping facilitate collaboration. Can you talk a little bit about Leading on Opportunity and the recommendations that were put forth from that report? I imagine that there are lots of conversations related to social capital and other recommendations that are a part of your work. How is My Brother's Keeper, Charlotte Mecklenburg, advancing that work?
So we are taking serious the recommendations and those key levers around how to move this community forward with regards to economic mobility, namely social capital, right? What we've done is, in a very comprehensive way, taking the notion of social capital and created definitions that really lay out a methodology of how it ought to be applied. We understand social capital as a relationship-based framework that kind of facilitates the intersections between belonging, wealth, and well-being. We understand it to represent three particular pillars, one being bonding, which is the immediate family, community, neighborhood that a young person belongs to, bridging, what I think we all are kind of familiar with, where we are bridging young people from one place to another, bridging opportunities to those young people. But I think to the point of being unique and a point of really driving this work forward to ensure that we can create transformation is linking social capital. In My Brother's Keeper, we define linking social capital as linking systems, organizations, and institutions through data, through investments, and through a service delivery coordinated framework. Essentially, Elizabeth, what we're looking to do from a social capital standpoint is how can we ensure that every Black and brown boy that's born in Charlotte Mecklenburg has everything they need to fulfill their purpose without institutional, organizational, or systemic impediment. And we think the best way forward for that is to bring in, from a collective impact framework, organizations and the ecosystem together to ensure our young men are not falling through the crack. I think another way that we are moving forward with this work is that the folks that informed the report, right? So when John Powell came to us and talked about targeted universalism, we took that serious and created a targeted strategy to move that work forward. When Dr. Ross Chetty surmised that if you change the conditions for Black and Indigenous boys, you can change the conditions for the entire community, we took that serious. And so this entire framework that we are putting forth is one where we are not looking to compete. We are looking to co-labor in this work, to co-design a framework by which our young men have everything they need to thrive.
I love that, and love that use of the term co-labor. Can you talk about your areas of focus? I know you mentioned a collective impact approach, but what are your key areas of focus?
That's a great question. And Dr. Barnes mentioned this earlier around a macro and micro kind of focus, where we are looking to not only be short-term responsive, but long-term strategic. And in our short-term response to the young men in our community, we have 6 focus areas. One is culture. The other is agriculture. The third is emergent technology, art, health and wellness, and entrepreneurship. So we have, because we are a collective impact model, what we've done is brought together 2 to 5, we call them collective impact organizations that are industry leaders in those particular focus areas. They've come together and co-created a framework from agriculture, from culture, from health and wellness that will engage and impact the lives of our young men in a very strategic and informative way. So those are our focus areas. And again, not only are we trying to be short-term responsive with that immediate engagement, but our long-term strategy is also thinking about the ecosystem and the policies and practices and procedures by which sustains that system.
Thank you for sharing those areas of focus. Can you tell us a little bit about, or give us an example of a key community effort that is supported by your organization?
Outstanding. So, man, we are excited about a few tactics, but I'll mention one in particular, and it was mentioned by one of the folks in the chat around what can Black men do to change the narrative. David Williams from Opportunity Insights, the executive director there, he mentions a data point where you may have a young Black boy that may not have a father in the home, but if he's surrounded by strong Black men, it has kind of this epigenetic impact on him. We can essentially dictate the biological expression of our young men just by having strong men in their presence. And so we've taken that data to heart. One of the things that you'll note as a theme from My Brother's Keeper is that the acquisition of knowledge is not enough. We want to try to apply it. So we receive the data, and then we try to instill and infuse that data in the strategies that we create. So using that particular data point, we have a strategy that we call the MBK Vanguard. Now, the MBK Vanguard is our volunteer strategy. What we are looking to do is recruit, educate, activate, and deploy men of color throughout the ecosystem of youth serving organizations. And what happens is we recruit these men. We have 73 so far. We're on a campaign for 300. You can go to our website and sign up. We are looking for men to adopt the MBK Vanguard mindset. And that mindset is around men who commit themselves to leading, to leveraging, and to lifting in community in order to build a legacy, where men are being very deliberate and intentional about being present, to Righteous's point. Men who are doing it in their families, they're in community, they're in the boardroom where they represent, right? These men are supported by the same nomenclature around what does leading and leveraging and lifting mean, and then what does that mean for the legacy that we are collectively trying to instill and leave behind. And so having these men, trained men, that go through our kind of training where we talk about communal fathering, talking about the natural father, the extended father, community communal fathering, and programmatic fathering. What does that mean? Well, we take a mentoring to another level where fathering now is kind of the paradigm that we go about the engagement and relationship building with our young people. All of this undergirded with the spirit of adoption. This is to speak to the long-term framework. Sometimes mentor relationships don't last always, but when we're talking about a fathering framework, now we're talking about a lifelong commitment to be with you, to help you navigate this life with the ebbs and flows that this life brings to us all, to have a support and a network there to kind of walk alongside you in that regard. And the way that we do that is to ensure, and I heard Brother Sean mention this, from the block to the boardroom, from janitors to judges, from news anchors to news makers, we want men to commit themselves to leading, to leveraging, and to lifting the community in order to build a legacy. And so My Brother's Keeper Vanguard is a strategy that I'm excited about the way it's moving, and more excited about the impact it will have on this community.
Leading, leveraging, and lifting, and I can certainly feel your excitement. This is clearly passion work for you. Why do you feel it's important to support young men of color?
Man, that's a great question. And before we get into a kind of deep framework, to be simple is love, right? Have a profound love for humanity, in fact. And so when we think through our young men, when I speak for myself, when I become exposed to the historical context, when I become exposed to the deliberate and intentional and comprehensive impediments that have been put in place to try to subdue and subject our young men to something that is subhuman in many regards, I feel compelled through that knowledge to apply a certain level of intent, to be deliberate. In fact, I believe that, like my father would tell me, that righteous indignation, that it demands of us action. And so it's hard for me to sit back understanding what Dr. Moore brought out from a data standpoint and not be moved to action, to understand the heart of someone like Dr. Frank Barnes and the work he's trying to do for our school system here, and not be moved to action. And so when I think about our young men, I am enthused to be a part of it, and I'm looking at myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to say that this is the programmatic praxis or the organizational praxis of Ubuntu, where I am because you are, to save our young men, to create systems by which the fullness of their humanity can be affirmed, is in fact affirming my own humanity. And so this is a framework of self-love in that regard. So that's kind of what drives why Don Thomas wants to put his hands to the plow to change the narrative for our Black and brown boys here in Charlotte-Mecklenburg.
May we all obtain that same passion. And I do want to give people the opportunity to ask any questions, but also to say, how do we get involved? If someone wants to be a part of the Vanguard program, what is the next step?
Outstanding. So you can visit www.mbkcltmecklenburg.org. That's mbkcltmecklenburg.org. There you'll see a volunteer page. You click that, and then you'll see the kind of the survey that we have for brothers to sign up for the Vanguard. From there, what we're doing is we'll go through a symposium. We had a symposium already where we kind of go through the process and the MBK Vanguard mindset. But once you go there, you'll fill out that survey. From there, you'll have some correspondence sent your way about the next training that's coming up. And by the way, there are organizations within our MBK Alliance that we're building where they are looking for your presence. They are sending up volunteer needs for men of color. And so what we want to be able to do is not be arbitrary with sending volunteers, but we want to make sure that we are sending trained men with a certain paradigm that goes to the organizations that need your presence. So that's one way. You can also go to the website to invest as well. So that would be the next step for anyone listening here.
Well, thank you. And thank you for sharing the great work that you're doing here locally, which is so vitally important. And I just want to really say an additional thanks to Commissioner Jarrell, our distinguished panelists, Dr. Frank Barnes, Sean Dove, Righteous Kit, Christopher Timothy Fowler, Dr. James Moore. You all were so amazing and shared such powerful information. I was inspired. I'm sure that our audience was inspired. I can see the comments in the chat. I'd also like to recognize and thank Sally and Russell Robinson of the Robinson Center, our Foundation for the Carolinas President and CEO, Michael Marsicano, our Executive Vice President of Civic Leadership, Brian Collier, for their ongoing leadership and support for these important community conversations. We invite you to join us for our next conversation next month, which will focus on social capital. And I just want to say thank you to all of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And we invite you to discuss, connect, and get involved. Have an impactful day.